A huge security operation is already in place in Belfast for the visit of US President Joe Biden. He's going to arrive in Northern Ireland this evening to mark the 25th anniversary of the signing of the Good Friday Peace Agreement. He's proud of his Irish roots. He's always praised what politicians did to secure peace back in 1998. But the visit is overshadowed by a little bit of unrest in the country. You could say that, with the Democratic Unionist Party continuing to boycott the Northern Ireland government, and with petrol bombs thrown at officers during an illegal Republican parade over the weekend. Pipe bombs found today. Police are on high alert for this presidential visit. So is the Good Friday Agreement under threat? Joining me now is the former taoiseach of Ireland, Bertie Ahern. Mr. Ahern, it's a real pleasure to speak to you on a day like this, on a time like this. Let's just start by remembering the Good Friday Agreement. You were taoiseach at the time. Talk to us about your abiding memory of that time, that agreement that you said was a new beginning for Northern Ireland, for the island of Ireland, and for these islands.
Yeah, I think at the time it was bringing together nationalists and Republicans, Unionists and Loyalists, and with the two governments. So it was, there were 8 parties, the two governments chaired by Senator Mitchell. And it certainly, brought an end to 30 years of violence. Thankfully, there's been some killings and some bad events, since Oma. But by and large, it's been very, very peaceful. Last night, you showed young people on the streets, but obviously people behind them giving them petrol bombs. But I was talking to some of the people there today. There were about 20 of them. But it's been peaceful. Politically, it hasn't been so easy. I think Tony Blair and I, we had an inclusive process of bringing all the parties together, even those that had been previously associated with violence. And we dealt with a lot of the big issues at the time. But unfortunately, the one that disappoints me is the fact that the institutions of the agreement, the Assembly, the executive North-South bodies, have not been working very well. So that's where I think Rishi Sunak and the Windsor Agreement hopefully will bring a conclusion to that standoff. And there might be a few little bits left, but hopefully on the other side of the local elections, we might be able to sort that out.
And US President Biden, of course, visiting this evening. What hopes do you have for that visit?
Well, to be honest, I'm very sad that he wasn't addressing the Stormont, because if Stormont had been up and running, I think he would have been there. That would have been a great occasion for them, for the people who were elected 15 months ago. It's a lost opportunity. They would have been seen across the world. He would have an opportunity again, I think, to recommit to further investments to help those people who need it in different areas of the north who haven't benefited over the years. Anyway, that opportunity is blown. Let's be frank about it. But I'm sure the Ulster University he goes to tomorrow is a tremendous new facility at the heart of Belfast. The party leaders will be there. That's a good occasion. But I think the trip to Belfast and to Northern Ireland generally would have been far better if the institutions had been functioning.
You already mentioned the young people that were out on the streets this weekend, the dissidents, the violence that there was. You've already mentioned, of course, that there has been some over the years. I want to mention the young factor here, because during the Troubles, during that 3-decade period, it was a huge proportion. It was around a quarter, I think, of the deaths from the conflicts were people between the ages of 18 and 23. You're now seeing young people still on the streets, these dissidents, these young people. Why then is it so important that young generations understand the Troubles?
Well, I think the problem always has been in the north, right back from the time I was in school in the 60s, that when there was a vacuum in the political position, when the politicians didn't fill the centre ground and be seen to be doing their work in the assembly, that tended then to drift out to the streets. And there's always a day. It's not happening really now. I mean, there's a handful of them, and that's always a danger. You don't need too many to cause trouble or to give bad camera shots around the world. And that's what they're doing. It's it themselves they're affecting. But there are obviously people behind them who, never agreed with the agreement. And unfortunately, there are some of those elements that, continually rise their head whenever they get an opportunity. But I think overall, if the politicians were back dealing with the issues of the day, dealing with the problems for the people of Northern Ireland, that would wane very quickly.
So it is very much about the current political system. Now, Sunak, the Windsor framework, it held up, but there were concerns there about the impact that post-Brexit trade arrangements would have on the Good Friday Agreement. What stood out to me when I've been sort of looking at your words about the Good Friday Agreement over the last few days is that you said that when you were all sat around the negotiating table, you're multi-parties, you could have predicted a lot of things, but you didn't predict Brexit. Just how much did Brexit worry you?
Yeah, Brexit was a disaster, to be frank. For 7 years, it's created difficulties. And the real problem, Rosanna, is that it brought up issues that we had long settled. People had stopped talking about the border. People had stopped talking about customs posts and checkpoints. It had gone out of the everyday language. It had gone out of the political arguments even. Brexit brought all that back again. It brought back the issues about when there would be a border poll would be triggered from the Good Friday Agreement. And it was just totally unhelpful. Now, I have to say, I'm not going to quote anything I said myself at the time of Brexit, but John Major and Tony Blair both spoke openly and frankly that if Brexit did happen, that this would occur, and they were 100% right. But anyway, we'd 7 years at that. I think Rishi Sunak has genuinely tried very hard since last October to find a solution to that. I certainly appreciate the efforts he's put in. I think most people in the island of Ireland, the DUP feel that everything isn't yet achieved. Rather than giving out about that position, I think maybe we should try and see if there's some other piece that needs to be put in place to try to rectify that. And I suppose... Yeah.
It's just an unbelievably relevant conversation at the moment, isn't it? Separatism, unions, reunifications, exits. I just want to get your view, Mr. Ahern, on Scottish independence, the prospect of that, the idea of it. What does it look like through your lens?
Well, I think certainly what's from our position in Ireland, I believe it would be a bad idea to have a referendum here until two things happen. One, that the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement are up and running, and two, that you prepare the case. Now, we have neither of those at the moment. So there will be a referendum someday because it's provided for in the Good Friday Agreement, and it was a commitment that was given that if we agreed consent, and the only changes can be made constitutionally or on the basis of the consent of the people in Northern Ireland, but that people have an aspiration for either union or unity. And that's the balance that Tony Blair and I struck in the Good Friday Agreement. In Scotland, if you were talking to me a year ago, I would say probably the argument for another Scottish referendum looks strong and they had to convince the British government. Now it seems to have drifted back down the agenda a lot.
How different do you think the negotiations would have been in a time like now, where there's social media, where there is so much opinion, where it's very easy to give opinion?
Well, I think it'd be impossible. I'm not a big lover of social media. My age would give that away, I suppose. But I think we had eight parties, two governments, probably on the final week. We'd several hundreds of people in castle buildings because people brought in all their politicians, they brought in their executives, and the negotiating teams were already there. So at any stage, it could have had 200 or 300, 400 maybe. I don't know how many was in the building, but it would have been very hard to keep control and to keep it centralised negotiation, as we did between George Mitchell, Tony Blair, and myself. And my team was Liz O'Donnell, David Andrews, and a small team of officials. So Tony Blair was the same. I think it'd be very hard to control that situation in the age of social media.
I think I quite agree with you there. Look, when negotiating the Good Friday Agreement, it seemed that you focused a lot more on what people were for rather than what they were against, at least in some strands of it. Now, when it was signed, it was held up as potentially a model for other international conflicts, a kind of cut and paste that could be used elsewhere, but it doesn't seem to have translated to other regions. Are you disappointed by that?
Well, I think there's not a week goes by, and certainly not a month that goes by, that there's not political parties, negotiating teams, governments, other NGO bodies that come to Northern Ireland from all over the world, and they explore, what happened, what we did, not only in 1998, but what we did in the years after, right up to 2007, when it's genuinely felt that we got things reasonably stable, and it took us that long. So my message always to these delegations, I don't meet all of them, but I meet some of them, is that these things aren't easy. That negotiations, you need certain ingredients. One, you need that people are not prepared just to have the status quo. If people like the status quo and they don't mind violence and they're not prepared to move away from it, then it's very hard to convince them. I think the second thing is you have to put yourself in the shoes of the other side. You have to understand what are the issues of the people who are opposed to you. And I think you have to be prepared to negotiate fairly and try and get balances and compromises. If you want to just force your own way through, that seems to, I'm not an expert in the Middle East, but when I look at the Middle East, it looks as if people just want their own way and they force it through by might and by physical force. Well, you're never going to find solutions if you follow those kind of ingredients in the conflict.
I think that's some advice that could be used in so many places. Just want to end by asking you, do you have faith in humanity?
I do, and sometimes, Rosanna, you have to go around the mulberry bush. You know that mulberry bush they've been talking about for hundreds of years, and I think sometimes you have to go around it a few times before you get people to finally compromise. But it's better than violence. The mulberry bush is a safer bush.
It's absolutely better than violence. Bertie Ahern, it's been an honour to speak to you on a day like this. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Rosanna.